Oh, wait, it's not necessarily the defense may not give opening statements today, but the government rests today. It's
Okay.
complicated. It's complicated. Hey, where's that music that I usually rely on to let me know it's no longer the weekend, but it's Monday and we're back at Law and Legitimacy? Welcome, everyone. Welcome, 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 welcome. Day 52 of United States of America versus Biggs begins today, and what a day it will be. I've got a news flash. The government will rest. It won't be like God adding the seventh day of creation where he took the day off and said, "It is good. It is damn good," except for that thing that I made called humankind, which in my foreknowledge I know will reject my word and bring upon itself original sin and inevitable suffering throughout all eternity until they are redeemed or choose not to be redeemed, in which case they'll be damned. But I don't want to get into theology. The government will rest today and the case will come to the defense. It's possible, Mr. Biggs reserved opening statements. It's possible the court will order us to give our opening statement today. It's possible that we'll proceed seriatim through the various defendants' cases. Ethan Nordine is the lead defendant. He has witnesses on tap, and there is an order that permits him to call him out of turn regardless of the state's case. So stay tuned. But it appears that the defense evidence is likely to take no more than 2 weeks, could take as quickly as a week, depending on whether the defendants choose to testify. And for those of you who are experienced criminal law practitioners or observers, you know that decision is always made at the very end of the trial. The right to testify or not belongs solely to the client. And a lawyer serves merely as an advisor in that instance. Whereas in most other things that occur at trial, lawyers are captain of the ship and can make the tactical and strategic decisions with consultation of their client. When it comes to whether to testify, the client's word governs and is law. I don't know whether Mr. Biggs will testify at this point. Obviously, there have been discussions. I don't know whether the other 4 defendants will testify. But the good news is this trial will end someday, and I will return to New England, where in at least northern Vermont, there's still snow on the ground. And on this spring day, this beginning of spring, I haven't seen a lick of it because I've been trapped here since January 2nd. And that is my life, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, it's a balmy 28 degrees here in Greensboro, North Carolina this morning, so feeling like spring.
28 degrees in North Carolina. Wow. Hey, how is the Wolfpack doing in the NCAA tournament?
You're a funny guy, Norm. You're a funny guy.
I guess they lost. Huh? Well, Michigan didn't even make the tournament. So what do I have to say?
It's been a down year in the Tar Heel State. North Carolina didn't even make the tournament. Duke had a very strong showing in round 1, and then got pooped on in round 2. NC State had some injury to one of its key players coming out of the ACC tournament, and ultimately couldn't get it done either. So here we are. I think Princeton is still alive, which is completely nuts considering they were a 15 seed. I think we had Farley Dickinson beat Purdue, which was the overall number 1 seed.
Yeah.
And I haven't even checked scores from last night, but the only ACC team left out of 5 going into the round of 32 was the University of Miami, the U. So we'll see how it goes. This year has been wonky. I think anybody who has a bracket is probably just throwing it away at this point. And that might sound like a cliche, but this year is unlike any that I've ever seen in terms of more obscure or lower seeded teams just getting it done in pretty dominant fashion. They're not last minute, last second shots like we've come to get used to with March Madness. These are pretty decisive victories, especially in the case of Princeton, which I was just, personally not ready for.
Well, I unfortunately didn't catch a game at all this weekend. I was busy at work preparing opening statements for Joe Biggs. We may have to give it this morning, maybe later in the week, but I'm ready. Let's see what the judge wants to do.
Sounds good.
What about the Donald? What's going on in Trump world? So last week, I see in my news feed that New York is bracing itself for a potential arrest of Donald Trump, and I'm like, huh? Oh, come on! I'm thinking this must be gossip out of Mama Papa Palooza's Twitter account, but no, it was reported by NBC News, and they say they had 3 sources among law enforcement officers who say the city is bracing itself. Then the Donald went on to Truth Social, I think, and announced that he was likely to be indicted as quickly as Tuesday. I don't know whether that's true or not, but the criminal investigation, there is an ongoing, we know this much, there is an ongoing criminal investigation and a grand jury, a New York State grand jury, evaluating whether Donald Trump violated New York state law in connection with his payment of money to Stormy Daniels as part of a hush money payment. And so apparently New York is looking at a number of things. Federal prosecutors have already passed on whether this constituted a campaign finance violation. Trump paid the money through his lawyer, now convict Michael Cohen, and prosecutors didn't think there was enough to go after Donald there. And the reason being that he could have brokered this payment, not simply as part of his presidential campaign, but to avoid the embarrassment of this woman saying Donald fiddled about with me, back when I was a porn star. New York may be looking at a similar claim from a state statutory perspective. It may also be looking at claims that that people lied to investigators in the course of the investigation. It may also be looking at potential fraudulent paperwork. In any case, these events all relate back to a period years ago, I think 2018 and earlier. And Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, motives in bringing this case forward at this point are reasonably called into question. When I first heard that Donald might be facing criminal prosecution, I thought, good. That's a triumph for the rule of law. We want to say that we are a government of laws and not men, and that no person is beyond the law. No sitting president in the United States has ever been charged criminally, nor has a former president been charged criminally. And I know, Lawyer Will, you're out there right now typing a note about, well, what about Richard Nixon, who stepped down before he could be impeached? But even he wasn't charged. And so, Bragg is stepping into virgin territory here if, in fact, he chooses to bring a charge against the Donald. If the grand jury is apparently close to reaching a conclusion, but according to press reports this morning, there is one more witness who they're going to hear from today, and it's unclear whether that witness will tip the scales in favor of the president. It's another former lawyer associated with Trump who's going to apparently cast some doubt on some of the testimony that Michael Cohen has offered the grand jury. But let's say he does get indicted. That in and of itself would be a shocking event.
Well, before we go on, Norm, because I've got these 4 questions here on the screen, but there is some background here that's relevant. We know that the Southern District of New York declined to prosecute this. So
that's the
federal body declined to prosecute under these lines. So I have just sort of I guess a very fundamental or a basic question as to what purview the state of New York has over what appears to be a violation of federal law in this context. So on this first question of whether Trump will be indicted, what, if any, decision, what if any value does the Southern District of New York's decision to not prosecute have or bear on the states? And also, to what end should we expect if there is an indictment issued?
Well, so the relationship between state law and federal law falls within the legal category of federalism. We have concurrent sovereigns governing our every breath and footstep in the United States. You are either a domiciliary or a resident or a person present in state A or territory B while you breathe. And that state A or territory B is also part of the United States. And so while in theory, the federal government's jurisdiction is limited to the enumerated powers that the Constitution and implied powers that the Constitution gives, the fact of the matter is that those powers are quite extensive, and there's an extensive penal code. Harvey Silverglate did a great book called 3 Felonies a Day, and he noted that
Love that title.
back at the time of the founding, there were about 40 or 44 federal criminal offenses. Now there are thousands of them, and no lawyer can actually give an accurate number, because when you take the aiding and abetting statute or the conspiracy statute, and then you superimpose those on the substantive statutes, wire fraud, this, that, or anything else, there are an infinite number of ways you can break the law. And in Silverglate's rendering, each of us breaks federal law at least 3 times each day, giving prosecutors an unlimited ability to choose when and if to prosecute. And that should be scary, because those prosecutors can choose for reasons independent of whether there's probable cause to believe you've broken the law to prosecute you. That should scare everyone, Silverglate says. And it's the relationship of there's nothing that prohibits state law and federal law from mirroring one another. The OJ case is the famous example of that, or not the OJ case. Oh, doggone it! I'm trying to. Who was the name of the defendant who was beaten so badly and caused the LA? Rodney King.
Yes.
The officers who beat Rodney King and were videotaped doing so back in the 90s were acquitted. First by a California jury for their conduct associated with that beating. They were later prosecuted by federal prosecutors for the same event. And people want to say, hey, wait, what about double jeopardy? Doesn't double jeopardy prohibit you from being charged with the same crime twice? It does, so long as it's the same sovereign that's charging you. So the federal government couldn't sue, bring an action against you, lose it, and then bring it again. But there's nothing to prohibit a state court from doing so, because it's a different sovereign and it's acting within the sphere of different laws. Now, I've objected to this any number of times in courtrooms.
I imagine you have.
It's a form of existential double jeopardy, but the courts don't recognize existential double jeopardy.
Meta double, right?
Yeah. So, I think the New York decision not to prosecute with respect to election fraud and campaign finance violations is persuasive to New York, but not binding on New York. And so if Bragg can find a statute that covers the conduct and can persuade a grand jury that there's probable cause to believe the law is violated, then off he goes.
Well, it was reported early that Bragg was losing interest in a prosecution. This is months ago, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm also curious as to the relevance of the statute of limitations, whichever relevant statute that might be. But we're talking about conduct. How many years old at this point, Norm? It's 2023. We're a quarter into the year. This conduct arose sometime 2017-ish. And so we're really running up against something critical, I think, of, kind of shit or get off the pot, as they say, with respect to a prosecution pursuant to this fact pattern. But I guess, do you think that could be a reason that they're doing it now? Or are you more cynical in the way that I am and think that perhaps the, diffuse yet coordinated strategy of impeding Trump's election prospects has shifted such that these more low-level, state-level affairs are going to accumulate to his detriment? Because we could look at Georgia for a meaningful comparison to say, there may be 4 cases that Trump is having to deal with right now, right? We've got the raid on Mar-a-Lago and the sensitive documents. We've got the Georgia election interference claims talking about, I guess him pressuring electors not to certify, et cetera. You've got the Stormy Daniels stuff here in New York, and then perhaps even one more. And if somebody in the chat would probably do well to remind me what that fourth one is.
The J6, whether
that's right. That's right. How could I overlook that? Yeah, that's right. So it seems to me that maybe I'm getting to question number 4. What is the big takeaway here? And we can get back to the extradition issues, because I think that's more federalism, more 10th Amendment stuff. But, my big takeaway from this, Lawyer Will says this is 100% a political prosecution. He says it's an obvious political prosecution. Thinking Man says everything that's being done regarding Trump will ensure that no Democratic vote is lost by a person changing their mind and voting Republican. All this political prosecution will harden Trump's support. Lawyer Will says it's such a strained theory, paying someone to be quiet as a campaign contribution. BTL says, this is fairly terrifying, I think, in respect to what you were talking about with respect to every single person committing 3 federal crimes per day. And then Thinking Man also asks you here, Norm, how do the Proud Boys feel about Trump now?
Well, let me do thinking man's. The last line of my opening statement, should I give it in its current form, is if there was a crime committed on January 6th, the one man who committed it isn't on trial here. Donald J. Trump. So the Proud Boys feel very much as though they were used by the president. He took to his bully pulpit and tried to persuade a nation that the election had been stolen, and encouraged people to come to Washington, got them fired up, and then disappeared when the fight was lost. Whether he actually believed, I think he does believe to this day that the election was stolen. I think many people do. I think there were enough irregularities to make it a debatable point. From a pragmatic perspective, it's in the rearview mirror for me. But as to Donald, I don't think there's any love lost between the Proud Boy and the Donald. But returning to this potential prosecution in Manhattan, I do think it's pretextual, and it kind of stinks. And I think it's a mistake for Bragg and company to prosecute Trump, because basically what it does is it gives him the biggest stage possible. And I think that among his supporters, this won't matter at all. It'll be regarded as a political witch hunt. It'll further delegitimize law enforcement efforts in Manhattan. Already, I see critiques of Bragg as a Soros-backed prosecutor who's favored returning violent criminals to the streets by his manipulation of the bail system and his support of bail reform in New York, and who has made selective decisions not to prosecute, which have made the streets less safe. Trump has out and out called him a racist, and Bragg, it does look like he's very politically ambitious. It's a case that I think those close to events suggest will be hard for the prosecution to win, because there are lots of other reasons besides trying to keep her quiet in the campaign for paying hush money, such as keeping his wife happy. And, then there's the mixed motive theory about whether the case will get to the jury. Mike, you raised the statute of limitations issue. Assuming there's a 5-year statute of limitations, I suspect that's what's really driving things now. Bragg has to decide whether now to take, as the statute is about to expire, his best shot or lose the ability to take the shot at all. Bragg can take his best shot, become a darling of the left, and
that's what I was going to say. There's really no political consequence to him taking his shot, right? At least in today's day and age. He's in New York. He's surrounded by an apparatus that supports this, whether it's credible, pretextual, or otherwise. And so that's kind of where I'm sitting right now. Is that if he declines to take his shot, what is the implicit message he's sending to those who would have otherwise had his back?
Yeah, and so I think it's inevitable that there will be some action against Trump. Moving to the next question you asked, so will he be indicted? The smart money, in my view, says yes. He will be indicted on something. How that indictment will be handled is an interesting question. There'll be a warrant out for his arrest. Will he voluntarily appear to address it? He's not obliged to do so. He could stay in Florida and say New York can enforce its law, when I get there, and maybe I'll get there, maybe I won't. Let's suppose that he decides not to go. There is an interstate compact among the states, and there are many interstate compacts that tie the states together in the republic. Remember, each state is an independent sovereign with respect to its own police power. And so when state A, in this case New York, issues a warrant for a person's arrest, and the person is not to be found in state A, the purposes of justice from state A's perspective are frustrated. So what's its option? Its option is to locate the person and then to seek a governor's warrant. That is a warrant demanding the state in which the person resides arrest the person and bring him to New York. There are not all offenses are extraditable. New York would have to agree. The Governor Hochul would have to agree to sign a governor's warrant. I suspect Bragg has already determined whether or not she'll do so. Although it would be a nifty political move for Bragg. Suppose he got Trump indicted and Hochul decided not to sign the governor's warrant. Then Bragg could have the best of all possible worlds.
That's exactly right.
Bask in the glow of the accusation, and Trump haters would regard him as a hero. Hochul would be demonized, and if Bragg had ambitions for Hochul's office, he could say in the next campaign, Governor Hochul deprived you of justice. I will assure that justice be done.
So, I mean, that represents a realistic probability. It may not be the best probability here. I don't necessarily think that Governor Hochul would decline to extradite, or at least if she does, I'm not aware of what incentive structure is there to have her decline.
I think she signs the extradition warrant.
So let's make it to that third subpart then. Will DeSantis honor the extradition?
The language of the extradition compact is written in terms of shall not may. And so if a governor presents a warrant for the extradition to the so-called host state, the only questions that a defendant can raise is whether they've named the right Donald J. Trump and whether they've alleged a crime. And so in Florida, Trump would have the ability to challenge the warrant on those grounds and on those grounds alone. He couldn't call, well, he can, but Governor DeSantis has a mere ministerial role in that case. And if Governor DeSantis chose not to obey the statute, in my view, Governor DeSantis would be doing what Mike Pence, what Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to do, and that is ignore the law. So this would be a separate case. So this is how it'll likely play out. Trump will get indicted. Hochul will sign the governor's warrant. It'll be presented to DeSantis, and Trump will demonize DeSantis in the same way that he did Pence and call upon his supporters. Look, Mike Pence betrayed you on January 6th by not recognizing the valid electoral slates. Mike Pence endorsed the stolen election, and Governor DeSantis is nothing more than Mike Pence's retarded little brother, or whatever Trump will say. But in both arguments, I think Trump is wrong. Because
but does it necessarily matter to the extent that he is able to focus his base's support on DeSantis's position? Because right now, we ended the week last week talking about sort of the silent campaign of Governor Ron DeSantis, and there's stuff going on back and forth over whether he is violating a statute under Florida law of resign and run, et cetera. And so what I've got on the screen here is something that I find really compelling. Mike Cernovich has been an outward supporter of Ron DeSantis, Big Ron, as he refers to him, over the last, I would say, year and a half at least. And he has been supportive largely to the detriment of Trump, right? He contrasts DeSantis's positions and the way that he goes about stuff favorably against where Trump failed. However, over the weekend, what I realized is that Cernovich is really criticizing DeSantis' silence on this issue. He believes that the opportunity here to be a leader shouldn't be waffled or fumbled. And the tweet reads, "I'll never support someone who shows weakness during historical moments. That's why I turned against, quote unquote, Trump over his pardon list. DeSantis is remaining silent. Not good. He must embrace his destiny and face down evil, or else please don't even run. Will be a massacre." Right?
Well, so I think Mike is wrong on this, and I like Mike. Mike's an old friend. I've known him since 2003. But when Mike started peddling Pizzagate, he lost a lot of credibility, as far as I'm concerned. And picking on DeSantis for remaining silent in this instance costs Mike credibility. DeSantis has a bit part in this. DeSantis can politically call on Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, not to indict. But that's a call that would be purely political in character and has no practical effect. DeSantis's role will be, if presented with an extradition request, to either honor it or not. And under the interstate compact, the questions will be limited. Did Bragg name the Donald J. Trump, who has been served with, that New York seeks to extradite? And the question will be, I doubt there's another Donald J. Trump. Does the New York indictment define a crime? Well, let's see what the indictment says. If those two questions are, in fact, it's the right Trump and it's the right Donald, then DeSantis's role is merely ministerial. So should DeSantis be saying, the chief executive of Florida, to the top law enforcement officer in Manhattan, don't sign the warrant, it's political bullshit? Maybe he should, but his responsibilities as chief executive of Florida are merely ministerial here. So what does Mike think you should be doing?
Well, I mean, let's game theory a little bit. So let's say, for example, DeSantis, he is a lawyer, but he also has a team around him that's gaming for this as well. So let's say, for example, he sees the scope of what he's able to do in this situation as something more than ministerial. Because I would argue, Norm, just as a point of federalism, that the mere allegation of a crime against another a state of a resident of another state shouldn't be on its face sufficient, right? If we're in a legitimate system, perhaps yes. But I think that the context around this begs a bit more of DeSantis's duty here. And maybe I'm completely off the reservation, but it doesn't seem as though, and this is where I think I align with Cernovich's thinking, it doesn't seem as though that is the powerful position to take if you're DeSantis and you are courting a run for the presidency, that you're going to sit idly by and allow the bluest of blue states with what is a pretextual prosecution of a former president who's also going to be running in this race to use their authority, their state level authority, and force you to extradite one of your own citizens who happens to be the former president, without being a little more forceful in holding their feet to the fire over the merits of that issue, right?
You may be right, but I mean, I guess I come down on this as a rule of law guy, and recognize that prosecutors have enormous discretion. Grand jurors, you've heard the old line, a good prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich. I don't know whether Bragg's a good prosecutor or not, but it's easy to get an indictment. But I think I would say to Donald Trump the same thing I'd say to a young black kid stopped by a cop when he thinks the stop is outrageous. You don't fight it on the streets, you fight it in court. And when you fight it on the streets, you often make things worse. In the case of New York State versus Donald J. Trump, if Bragg is able to persuade a grand jury to indict, then Trump should address that matter in court. To call for DeSantis to take efforts to oppose lawful process in New York is almost to call for a species of nullification. It's one governor reaching into another state and saying, no, you're wrong. You can't use your lawful process as you see fit. I just don't think that's right. And so my sense is, if this is a specious prosecution, Donald Trump should address it. He shouldn't require extradition. He should go to New York. He should appear in a courtroom, and he should carpe diem, seize the day. He should stand up and say, this is bullshit. And it'll cause, it will generate support for his base, and promote respect for the rule of law. If he did nothing wrong, well, then he can address the case. If he, but to polarize the country yet further, to make this into a sideshow and to turn it into a club with which to beat DeSantis, come on, Donald, grow up. We've got an economy to manage. We've got a world stage that is increasingly fraught. We've got an opioid and fentanyl crisis in the United States. We have a crisis incident to immigration and hospitals failing in the Southwest because of the influx of refugees in need of medical care, and an American people hungry for leadership. This is a sideshow, and I am not going to tell who gives a shit, right? I mean, the people who are listening to this, but I, for one, am not going to tolerate 2024 becoming a Donald J. Trump freak show. And if he's trying to make himself the ringleader of a circus and place DeSantis in a subservient ring while they toss peanuts at the elephants over whether or not he should go to New York to address specious charges, I've lost interest in both of them. If he gets charged, he needs to go to New York and address it, and the extradition drama should go away.
I think directionally, I think I agree with Cernovich still. I think the moment for DeSantis, I'm not speaking on the Trump side of things, but this moment for DeSantis begs a little more than the silence he's given since this news broke. It's been 2 or 3 days now. So I expect that if he's going to say anything, he'll say it today publicly, right? So if there is some sort of public admonishment of Bragg, or the New York system, or the pretextual nature of these inquiries, et cetera, he should do it now. And I think that I hold to that position. He does, whether he complies at the point that the indictment is sent down and the extradition is issued by Hochul, right, or Hochul. If it's ministerial at that point, whatever. But I think that before it gets to that point, we do have an issue.
If I were an advisor to DeSantis, I would say ignore this, because right now the Trump supporters are going to use this as an example of evil. Trump haters are going to use it as an example of good. I think Trump loses on the middle ground here. That most people still have enough respect for the rule of law such that if Donald is indicted, he needs to address the charge. And so I think by Hochul's remaining silent, he's more likely to appeal to the middle ground of those who've not yet made up their mind and gained support. But reasonable minds can disagree.
For sure. Well, and it's a complicated issue. That's why I wanted to break it out into these 4 questions, because I think that at least that affords our viewers and our listeners to break these issues apart and then put them in their proper place, right? These are all individuals who have their own level of discretion, right? So in the first question, you have Bragg. In the second question, you have Governor Hochul. In the third question, you have Governor Ron DeSantis. And then whatever the big takeaway is, that will reveal itself. But at least there's an analysis to be had on those first 3 points before we really get to talking about what the societal impact is.
So Justin Carter says Donald the martyr earlier. He said he had these issues under control in 2020. He had them under control with respect to the feds in 2020, but not the state. I think Justin is right. You can claim that Donald is a victim of Bragg's ambition, and that Bragg is being used in a political way that brings discredit to the law. I just don't know whether DeSantis needs to weigh in on this. As lawyers sometimes say, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. It so obviously stinks from this altitude that if I'm Donald Trump's advisor, I'd say Joe Tacopino's in there. He's a pretty good lawyer. You may want to add Pattis. Go extinguish that thing in a hurry. You got bigger fish to fry. This is a tawdry sideshow.
That's true. Well, look at us running over the time like normal. You can find every day's podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, etc. We are enjoying quite a few more live viewers every morning. I'll do my best to get the live stream scheduled the night before so that we can make sure everybody gets the notification. We're also live on Twitter. You can follow us at Pattis Podcast. So if you're in the car or whatever and can't seem to find your way to Rumble, or you haven't even joined Rumble yet, I don't know how people are getting to us every day. You can find us on Twitter. That's probably the app you definitely have downloaded on your phone, and we're streaming there every day. This is something we'll definitely take care to monitor in the weeks to come. And I know that tomorrow is sort of the big day, so I don't imagine we'll be starved for any more information to discuss on this. The one thing that we didn't get to today was obviously the New York Times reporting over the weekend about Alex Jones and the bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah. I want to talk about that later in the week. I mean, you want to talk, what's the biggest hoax in relating to the reporting on Alex Jones? It isn't his business with Sandy Hook. It's the notion that somehow a jury reached a conclusion that he was worth all that money. That's just ridiculous. And we will talk about it later in the week. Hey, Pete from Puerto Rico. What up, buddy? Rub it in.
Thinking Man says this podcast should be taxpayer supported. Look, we're not going to turn down any support at this point. So in lieu of getting state or federal governments to subsidize mine and Norm's appearance every morning, go to Locals, become a subscriber, please. And before you leave here, put a thumbs up on the video. That helps us a tremendous amount. Pete Atkinson, good morning from Puerto Rico. Love that you're bragging. Hope you use sunscreen.
All right, so get me ready for today. Objection.
Overruled.
I feel right at home. See you tomorrow, folks.
See you tomorrow, Norm.